Hello again, Jon Denton here. Thank you very much for visiting the channel. Now I'm going to be talking about Tiny Trax on PlayStation VR. So Tiny Trax proves a bit of a departure for Brighton-based studio Futurlab, who came to my attention with the quite incredible Velocity on PSP, and then the near flawless sequel which expanded upon that in massive ways in Velocity 2X, which was a PlayStation Plus game on PS4 and hit PlayStation Vita as well. Both those games were fine examples of sort of mechanically immaculate games done on a smaller budget, and they were both sort of 2D shooters. Velocity 2X taking the original scrolling shooter DNA and amazing teleporting gameplay and transposing half of it to a kind of Metroid style side-on thing as well. Amazing stuff. Tiny Trax, it's not really anything to do with any of that stuff, and when Futurlab announced that they were working on a VR game, I think this ended up being a surprise to many people, but you can still see the personality and sort of spirit of the studio in this game quite clearly. So what it is, you can see by watching the video, it's basically a slot racing game but set on kind of crazy tracks. So slot racing, if you don't know, Scalextrics to you and me, is the toy where you sort of control cars remotely using a trigger, normally an analog trigger that controls the speed, and just race at high speeds, and normally they fly off and the little connectors don't work properly. Here it's 4-player races, mainly online, and you actually have control over the corners, which is not something that you typically have in the same way in normal slot racing. So here, every corner that you hit, you have to steer around it, but you want to be pressing the analog stick. The game's controlled with analog stick on PlayStation VR. You want to be pushing the analog stick just enough so your little bar hits that green zone that you can see. Keep it in that green zone for a good drift and you'll fill up your boost, and then you can boost out of the corner, boost on the straights. And you'll also be switching lanes so you can keep on the inside track as much as possible. There's no competition over those lanes. You can sort of blend through and clip through the other cars. But at its best, when it's firing, it's a really, really fiery racing game, extremely intense, and it's all about maintaining that flow. And that's where the DNA is similar to Futurlab's previous games. It's all about maintaining that flow, that level of concentration, and when you do get into a flow around those corners, it does feel really good. So I want to now touch on 2 points, I think. Firstly, about the thing that's probably most interesting to people. Okay, this is a cool idea and a cool idea for a racing game, but why is it in VR? It's difficult to tell how cool the effect is just by watching a 2D video, so it's best to explain it. You really do feel like once you strap the headset on that you're sort of in and amongst these tracks. There are certain tracks where you're literally having to move your head around, even one where you put your head through a loop-the-loop to see different parts of the track. And the 3D effect, plus the fact that the visual stars allowed it to be one of the cleanest and brightest looking games on PlayStation VR. It doesn't have the kind of jaggy low resolution edges that we're used to seeing. It looks like sort of dinky toys travelling around very nice sort of model tracks, but as they get more complex, as they move into space in the sort of latter half of the game's track selection, they really do start to get quite complex and really kind of cool. And almost every single time a new track appeared when I was playing, in fact with some of the Futurlab people on their stream and Matt Murray from the Computer Game Show, there was an audible whoa every single time the track started, because it really does feel like you've been transported somewhere. Now VR does 2 things extremely well. We've discovered that. The first of which is immersion, particularly immersion in a first-person perspective. We've seen that in Superhot VR, my last PlayStation VR video, and Batman VR, and many, many other things. But it also does scale incredibly well, and that's to do with the fact that the 3D is so impressive, but also the fact you can move around in that space. And that's kind of the angle Tiny Trax is going for. Yes, mechanically this game could exist outside of VR, but the VR does add a lot to it. It really does. And while it might not be the real mind blower that you strap someone into the first time in the same way that travelling down into the deep in PlayStation VR Worlds or putting someone again into Superhot, it won't blow their mind in that respect. There is a kind of familiarity to the fact that it is almost a traditional game, but adds on layers of sort of amazing visual style and effects with VR that is probably actually a decent first or second try for someone who's really not that familiar with gaming as a whole but want to try VR. I will say though that mechanically while that flow state can be very satisfying, it can also be very irritating when it goes wrong. Basically, if you mistime the corners, if you go too early, if you hold your drift too long, the car basically comes to a standstill. It starts to feel like you're moving through syrup or glue. This is a deliberate design choice, and Futurlab has proven itself in the past to be masters of feel and motion within games. So there's a reason there is this kind of steep difficulty curve, and I have to say the single player is really hard. Perhaps tuned a little bit too hard. Maybe they might need to tone down some of those earlier tracks. It was actually quite off-putting because you're finishing in 4th place pretty much straight off the bat, and it takes a hell of a lot of effort even to get up into 3rd. But playing online, which is what the game's supposed to be, typically you'll be learning alongside the other players that play it. It won't be as brutal, let's say. But I imagine some people will be put off by the controls and the fact that can be slightly confusing to keep track of your car at sometimes. But I have to say, for such a departure, stylistically, for such a departure sort of mechanically, although there are seeds of previous games in there, for Futurlab, Tiny Trax is clearly very cool. And when you are in a 4-player race that's tight and you're all pushing each other and knowing that one mistake can be the difference between 1st and 4th place, it's definitely very, very appealing and very enjoyable. And I was having conversations, would it be the same without VR? And as you get into the more complex tracks, I don't think it would be. Those mechanics are solid. The drifting, cornering mechanics are solid and would work outside, but you can't really account for that feeling of immersion, especially when you stand up as well. It's a game I played largely sitting down, but you can stand up and look down on the tracks, and it is very reminiscent of looking at some really cool Hot Wheels set or some amazing Scalextrics that you might see at Christmas time when there's kids about. And yet stylistically, while it's not the most mind-blowing game you'll ever see in VR, credit must go to the artists and the designers at Futurlab for creating something, an aesthetic that is cool but also familiar. Less so for the front end. There are problems, very fixable problems with the menus. Actually just backing out from a lobby is proving extremely difficult. A theme at the moment, given that I've been playing a lot of Splatoon 2 as well on the channel. But they're easily fixable problems. The actual room that you're in for the menus is cool. It's just like a little garage, and it's nice to turn around in that. So overall, yeah, another strong entry in the PlayStation VR library after a period where it did feel like the platform was dying a little bit. I'm not going to put Tiny Trax on the same level as Super Hot VR, but I think that is kind of an experience all on its own. But this is another strong effort on PlayStation VR. Recommended. Given Futurlab's commitment to their previous games, it wouldn't surprise me if there's support going forward, and I must say works beautifully online, and when it's as tense as it can be, it really is a bit of a cracker. So yeah, fair play. And it's just good that there's more varied, interesting stuff that's coming out on PlayStation VR, and it's nice to play something that isn't just a shooter. So cool. Thank you very much for watching. As always, please do remember to subscribe to the channel if you're new. I've been Jon Denton, and I will catch you on the next video. Peace!